Good evening. It's been a few days now since I went down to see Winter's SEO and give him a game with my Sword of the Dawn Space Marines. So I thought I would do a bit of a debrief from the game, sort of give you a few of my thoughts on how it went, the new Space Marine Codex, from what I saw of it. Sadly I didn't get to bring it home. Not really a surprise, but you know, it would have been nice. That would have been an amazing end to the day. But never mind. I'll get one soon enough, and hopefully, if we can pick up some more subscribers, quite a lot more subscribers, then maybe, who knows? Maybe GW will start sending me free copies as well. That'd be very exciting. But still, debrief the day. So. It was an early start, 2.5 hour drive. I sort of just chucked everything in my car. I got a list planned the day before. Knew what I was taking. I printed everything off. I'd learned all the stats. And as is my sort of style, I panicked at the last minute the night before, and I thought, you know what, I'm just going to chuck everything in the car just in case I've missed something. I'd been through the list a couple of times already to make sure everything was packed, but I threw my entire 6,000 points of Marines in the boot just in case. So I got to Winters about 10:30, 10:30 in the morning. Long drive, so I was quite tired, but so got out of the car, said hello, and he said, "You'll never guess what's just dropped through the door about 5 minutes ago. The new Space Marine book. So we'll be using that today." I mean, as far as I was aware, they used to get them sort of literally a day or two before pre-order, sort of on the Thursday, maybe the Friday. So it just wasn't on my radar that he'd have the new book by then. So the thought of actually using it for the game was, it just hadn't occurred to me. So we had a big cup of tea, and we had to sit down for probably a good hour and a half, really. So just chatting, getting to know each other, making sure that we sort of we knew who we were, what my name was, sort of what my army was called, etc., etc. You know, all the helpful stuff that he does at the start of the videos to sort of encourage people to go and support his guests. So we had a good chinwag over a cup of tea. We had a flick through the book, and you know, I was sort of rapidly trying to rewrite my list to an extent at that point. My original list had got a couple of captains in it, so if I wanted to go with that, I was going to have to spend extra CP to take a second detachment, which I didn't really want to do, because we'd got some new stratagems, so we wanted to show off as many of those as we could. So I took one of the captains out and stuck a lieutenant in his place. Then we had a panicky moment and realised I couldn't find whether or not the existing supplements were going to stay. So we had a quick chat and decided not to use the Raven Guard list. Not to use the Raven Guard supplement. I was still going to use Raven Guard as my primogenitor, but we figured that potentially if the other supplements were being canned, then you know, using them in the battle report would just sort of stick it straight in the bin, kind of thing. So we hedged our bets and went with just a list straight out of the main rulebook, the main new Space Marine Codex. So I sort of went through, checked all the points off. So I swapped out one of the captains for a lieutenant. Chopped and changed a few other bits here and there, made a few adjustments. I think I stuck in a couple of extra infiltrators that weren't in the original list. What with the changes to some of the unit costs. I know the impulsor had gone down, although we didn't realise at the time it had probably gone down because of the invuln save has gone down. from a 4 up to a 5 up. So yeah, hands up, we missed that one. I have been back over the footage of the battle report though, and it didn't actually affect the outcome of the game. I only rolled 1-4 when I was making saves for the Impulsor in the whole game, and that was for an armour save against a big chopper, not an invuln save. So thankfully that didn't sort of mess up the result too much. Yeah, it looks like, having gone back over it, we've missed a few other bits and bobs. I hear that eliminators now hit on 2s, not 3s, which would have changed things. I certainly missed out using the Warlord trait from the Lieutenant. I used Hero of the Chapter and gave him a Warlord trait that lets an extra Phobos unit hit on an extra +1, which I didn't use at all throughout the game, which again would probably have benefited my eliminators, certainly at some point, and possibly the infiltrators as well in the first couple of turns, although they did well enough. As it happens, they killed the things that they were shooting at largely, so again I don't think that made too much of a difference. So having done that, we went and set up. At this point I still didn't know what I was going to be facing, so I must admit I was dreading facing the Death Guard. I've played them quite a bit at my club, and never had a really great record against them, or certainly not as good a record against them as I would like. I have picked up some wins, but others I've come out with either a draw or a loss when I feel I should have done better. I was sort of keenly watching the videos that were going up on his channel beforehand, because I knew he sort of adjusts what he uses based on what's been on the channel recently. So I hadn't seen the Death Guard in a little while, so it was me thinking I was going to be going up against them. But as it happens, he said no, we're going to use Orcs, which made me a lot more comfortable. I know what I'm doing facing Orcs. I play Orcs quite regularly at club, so I generally know what stuff does, and ultimately also I know how to counter it. The win wasn't hugely important. I honestly, genuinely wouldn't have minded if I'd lost the game. The one thing that I didn't want to do was make a fool of myself in terms of tactics. The idea for the day was that I would be able to sort of do well enough, and for it to be a good enough game, and an interesting enough narrative that I get invited back. So he certainly seemed more than happy to arrange sort of games against me in the future, so I'll definitely be in touch, hopefully when I've learnt a bit more of the new book. So yeah, we're up against Orcs, straightforward mission straight out the rule book. Again, I'd been looking sort of beforehand at the chapter approved mission pack and trying to sort of figure out what secondaries and so on I might look at taking, because if you're not aware, the secondaries from the chapter approved mission pack 2020 are not the same as those in the core rulebook. There are a lot of similarities and a lot of ones that are duplicated, but there are some different ones. So for example, Slay the Warlord is worth 6 points from the core book. If you look at the equivalent secondary in chapter approved, it's a sliding scale of points based on what turn you kill the Warlord, so you can score as many as 13. So I was sort of, I'd spent the week beforehand looking at those secondaries and trying to figure out what suited my army best. All that went out the window as well, because obviously when we got there with the new book, they've got faction specific secondaries, and we looked at those, and we had again a bit of a chinwag and sort of talked them through. Winters in particular liked the shock tactics, one where you push an enemy off an objective and you gain 3 points for it. That, if I'm honest, at the time that was probably the one that I looked at that I liked the least, and I would sort of stand by that. You'll notice at the end of the game we had a quick debrief, and we discussed that the shock tactics secondary requires your opponent to be on the objectives first, so that you can then push them off. That's not the way I like to play the game. I do like a patient style of game, or I try to play in a patient fashion, rather than jumping on the opponent turn one. I like to sort of soak up a bit and then hit back and sort of bring my counter punch in later, which you probably noticed as the game goes on. I didn't sort of push to bring on my reserves as soon as possible. That was a conscious decision. It was also partly based on what was on the table in front of me, but that's the way that I do like to play. Unless I desperately need them on the table straight away, I tend to prefer to sort of hold them back a bit. So yeah, the shock tactics one, I can see in certain situations it would be good, where you sort of potentially, especially if you're going second, and your opponent's jumping on the objectives so they can claim them in their next turn, and you then need to push them off. But the problem I find there is that if you're then pushing them off, you're on the objectives, so your opponent has easy targets, or their target selection is very easy in terms of what they need to be doing. That's a general criticism that I've got actually of 9th edition missions as a whole. All the missions have this sort of board control, scoring, progressive scoring in them, and it does result in games being very samey. Certainly to watch, not so much when you're playing in them, because you get caught up, or I certainly get caught up in the narrative a bit more. But certainly when you're watching them, I find it's very sort of structured in terms of the scoring, and I really liked Maelstrom for the randomness and the sort of the thinking on your feet element, knowing how to pick up objectives that you weren't necessarily expecting. So that was shock tactics. Yeah, I took it because it's brand new and we wanted to show it off, and it did help certainly. I think I scored it a couple of times during the game, but I don't think I'm going to be taking it a lot. Codex Warfare I did really like, shooting stuff or essentially killing units with the weapons that get buffed by your current active doctrine. I think that's very, very sort of flavoursome in terms of Marines. Again, I think it benefited my style of play in that sort of that patient fashion. I really picked up quite a few points from that in the later game turns, as I started to kill stuff with rapid fire and assault weapons, and then in particular melee weapons, because I do like my melee. I know Marines aren't exactly the best unit at melee, not the best faction at melee, but they do have decent choices, and I find if you commit to it, they can be very effective in that phase, as I think we showed in the battle report. That once I started getting into melee and picking my fights, not just random melee, just sort of all go, melee at all costs kind of thing, but once you pick your fights with Marines, then they can be very effective. And the last one was Oaths of Moment, which was a really interesting sort of secondary, and one that, must admit, when we first read it, we read it slightly differently. I think we did pick up the nuance to it before it sort of hurt us in terms of keeping track of where the game was. Essentially, you have 3 oaths that you can fulfill. One is not falling back or failing morale. I got very lucky on one turn, I think, when I needed a very low roll to pass my morale, and I got a 1, which saved my bacon and picked me a point up. I did fall back with 1 unit, but it does force you to make choices, because again, using Marines, falling back is a viable tactical ploy. The way combat works in 9th edition with your opponent picking the first combat after the charging units, you do have to be very, very careful in terms of where you're going, either having the durability to last several combat rounds or having the sheer damage output to take out enemy units in one turn. So falling back, it's certainly a double-edged sword, that secondary, because there are certainly instances where you will want to fall back. The big sort of personally, I think the game-winning strategy that I used during the game was blocking the centre of the board and blocking the orcs up in the stronghold. It was not my original plan. I must admit, it sort of evolved as the units moved around the table, and I saw that there was the opportunity. Ideally, I would have been, I would have managed to do a bit more damage in my opening shooting phase, and wouldn't have needed to. But as it happens, it was necessary, and the opportunity was there to do it. It did mean that I had to charge in with my impulsor, which we talked a little bit about off camera actually, whether or not it would be more sensible to hold back from the charge, given that the bone breaker would still be hitting me and potentially hitting me quite hard even though I charged. Obviously most vehicles don't really do a huge amount of damage, or most sort of tank type vehicles don't really do a huge amount of damage when they charge in, but the bone breaker in particular doubles its number of attacks from 1d6 to 2d6 when it charges, so it made more sense for me to initiate that charge and rely on the survivability of the impulsor to keep it hanging around into the next turn, rather than taking the charge and probably getting destroyed. I'm getting ahead of myself now. From start of the game, Winters chose the stronghold as his deployment zone. Again, I can see the narrative choice there, and it's probably the narrative choice that I would like to think I would have taken in his position. Again, we talked about the options before the game, and as we said, there are narrative hooks for him holding that stronghold at the start of the game, or for me holding it. Quite simply, had I deployed in there, I could have taken the orc stronghold whilst they were out on a raid, and this was his returning force coming back to claim their encampment from the Marines. Alternatively, and the one that he chose was for him to hold the stronghold and for the Marines to essentially be assaulting that position. Both, I think, have equal validity, but certainly from a narrative perspective, Winters felt more comfortable holding that stronghold, even though, as we said later on in the game, it probably wasn't the tactically advantageous choice for him to make. It certainly cramped his units up and bottlenecked them, and I was able to take advantage of that as the game went on. Hopefully you'll notice that my deployment was a little unusual. We did sort of touch on it in the video, where I said I'd deployed with no centre to my army. I can't believe I missed Winter's reference to Zulu. That's one of my favourite films of all time. I must have been concentrating on something else when he mentioned it, but the horns of the buffalo, and essentially what we had was the two horns of the buffalo being the two flanks of my army on the table, and the actual sort of the head part being just off my deployment zone. That was certainly one of the factors in bringing the reinforcement part of, or the strategic reserves of my army on in that position was to then strengthen that centre at that time. I had a unit of infiltrators and a lieutenant off to one side, another unit of infiltrators and some outriders to the other, snipers again just to the either side of the centre, and my second unit of outriders and the impulsor with the characters in, and the blade guard just off centre, ready to push up the middle at the appropriate time. The centre of my deployment zone was very open, and that was the key reason why I didn't deploy anything there. I know orc shooting isn't great, but he'd got a big unit of 15 looters. If he has a good day with the bone breaker and the kill cannon on top, that can rip something to pieces. And I've been burnt by killer can shooting before as well. The flat 3 damage on their rockets is immense if your opponent rolls well enough for their shooting. I've always struggled to get rid of them. The 5 wounds makes a big difference as well, because of a lot of the 2 damage weapons you're taking 3 wounds. I mean, I'd got my plasma inceptors, but I didn't really want to use them to target the killer cannons, because even overcharging it would have taken 3 wounding hits just to clear 1. So that was the main reason for sort of leaving the centre empty, was because anything that I deployed there was going to get shot, and a lot. So turn 1, I pushed the infiltrators up around the side, sort of one unit of infiltrators up around my right flank, through a little wooded area. The orcs were quite light on that side of the board, and there was just the shock drum dragster at the time, and the killer cans were inside that side of the stronghold, the encampment. So I thought I'll push the infiltrators up, and at that point I already had the idea that I was going to be bringing the dreadnought in on that flank to support them. I wasn't wedded to the idea, so had things changed and had it been needed elsewhere, then certainly I would have brought it in elsewhere. I did, before bringing it in, I did go around and have a look at all the potential spots on the board it could have come in, and what it could have supported when it came in that location. But the thing that really swung it for me again was the killer cans. Seeing that the dreadnought fist damage has gone from D6 to D3 plus 3, all of a sudden the average damage on that dreadnought fist is 5, which is 1 killer can. So it seemed the obvious target was for the dreadnought to go after those, because then on average I should be killing 1 with every wounding hit, and they haven't got the save to sort of resist that fist. So I could reasonably rely on, I thought potentially I'd be killing maybe 3 a turn. Potentially with a bit of extra damage I could sort of clear the squad in 2 turns. Sorry, a bit of supporting fire from elsewhere, that is. So that was that sort of right flank was the push up with the infiltrators. Originally I moved the lieutenant with them, the idea being that he would perhaps support them with his warlord trait, which I then forgot to use and didn't need, because they did enough damage to the dragster to take it out anyway. On the left flank, I didn't have as many infiltrators on that side, but I thought if I support them with the outriders and potentially some sniper fire and a bit of sort of ancillary fire popping in from elsewhere, then I was reasonably confident they could do quite well. As it happens, the infiltrators got wiped quite quickly. I think they took out sort of most of a couple of squads of Gretchen, but you don't really want to be shooting Gretchen with infiltrators. But the only other thing out there was the looters, and if I'd shot the looters, he was just using the stratagem to take out using the Grok shield stratagem anyway. So I did do that a couple of times just to force him to use it and spend the CP. Which definitely helped later on in the game when he was running short. But the plan really on that flank was just to tie up the looters, and I thought if I can just hold that flank, and swing the rest of my army through the encampment, then I'd take that. That was pretty much as it turned out in the end, although I had to chuck a bit more over that side of the table than I wanted to. And yeah, let's talk about the elephant in the room in that first shooting phase. Oh wow. I said to Winters at the time off camera, my dice do have a tendency to swing wildly like that every so often, and I'll either have a shocking turn or the most incredible turn of shooting, combat, whatever it may be. It happens, we've all had turns like that, I'm sure. It certainly would have helped to know that the eliminators hit on twos, because I think a couple of the snipers would then have hit Weird Boy Will, which potentially could have stopped the jump coming in from the orcs in that early turn. But it happens. We've all had them. You can't get too mad about it. You just got to get up and pick yourself up and plan for the next turn. The orcs incoming fire back was about, Winters rolled a lot of sixes. I don't know if it comes through on the video, but he rolled a lot of sixes that day. It was certainly balanced by his rolling to wound, which wasn't so hot. But that first sort of shooting phase, when the looters rolled 3 shots each, and the number of dackers he rolled, I was bricking it at that point. But we kept going. I lost the squad of eliminators, and I think, as I said, I lost 2 of the outriders. I think the infiltrators survived an extra turn, but then got wiped on turn 2. I got lucky with the outrider that was left being able to, or surviving and making the charge just to tie stuff up long enough that I could bring the inceptors across. The sort of the second and third turns was really setting up the win from a tactical point of view for me. It was by no means assured. I think the new book is certainly far more balanced than it was. It was too strong as a Marine player. I'll be honest, I'll hold my hands up again, I didn't enjoy using the book because it was too strong. It wasn't fun. This sounds really pretentious, but it wasn't a challenge. And then the games that I played with it, my opponents felt compelled to bring their strongest list, which, fair enough. If you're playing a book that's that powerful and you're worried that you're just going to get wiped off the table in 2 turns, you bring your strongest list. The problem was that I was still sort of bringing fairly thematic forces, trying to play narratively, and my opponents are bringing the nastiest stuff they can find, and as a result, it wasn't the type of game that I like to play, where the story is paramount, where you make tactical decisions based on the story. That's something that I don't think you can underestimate how important that is in both players having fun in a game. Sure, everyone likes to win, but the way to have an enjoyable game for both parties is to play the story and to play the background, not the rules. That's something that I'm keen to showcase going forward on my channel. It's something Winters does a lot, and certainly you watch a lot of his videos and you will see that he makes choices that aren't the most tactically sound in terms of him winning the game. However, they are the most obvious choices for the background and the narrative of the armies that he is using, and I cannot salute him enough for that, because the guy knows what he's doing. He knows the ramifications of the choices that he's making, and he does it anyway. And that is brilliant, because as someone who's watched his videos for 4 or 5 years, I would say they are head and shoulders out in front of those that I've seen in terms of telling that story and involving you in the narrative. There are others with higher production values, there are others with nastier, more complicated, cleverer lists, but he does something better than everyone else, in my opinion, and that is telling a very enjoyable, watchable story. Tangent. Right, so where do we go from there? So I sort of started pushing forwards along both flanks. I largely left the centre where it was. I think I moved the Outriders up a bit to get some shooting in, but I wasn't too aggressive at this point. I could see the Bonebreaker. What I was really waiting for was for the Inceptors to drop in. When I saw the Bonebreaker and the 2 custom booster blasters down the middle, my best shot at taking those out was the Inceptors, because with up to 30 shots in that unit, excuse me, with up to 30 shots from that unit, potentially 2 damage each when you drop in near a captain, they will take stuff down. I mean, they didn't finish off the Bonebreaker, but the reason they didn't finish off the Bonebreaker was because one of them ended up shooting at the truck instead to finish that off. I think had the whole squad taken on the Bonebreaker, it would have gone down in that one turn. As it was, I ended up with a lot of boys out in the middle of that encampment sort of area. There was the big unit of 30 that had jumped forwards onto the objective. The killer cans had pushed up. There was another unit of 12 came out of the truck. There was 10 knobs in the Bonebreaker, and there was Big Mac Bob waiting as well. And that was the point when I looked at the middle of the board and I said, I cannot clear this if it all comes at me. If everything hits me in one go, I'm a goner. And I firmly believe that, and certainly there's comments in the video about sort of oh, what a surprise, Marines sort of clearing the table again. But I think without that stoppage in the middle of the table, I was done for. If the knobs had charged, or if they'd managed to get rid of the impulsor, get the blade guard out, they would have just chaffed before the knobs. If the knobs had attacked first, I would have been gone. The blade guard would not have survived that. Similarly, if that big unit of 30 had sort of swarmed my eliminators and the lieutenant, as they potentially could have done, they were gone, and that would have left me with sort of 10 intercessors coming on from the table and a dreadnought that was a bit out of the way. So turn 2, I could see that I had to do something to break up the orc charge and stop them hitting me all in one go. We got very excited when we started reading the orbital bombardment stratagem in the morning. I don't think either of us had quite grasped the nuances of it at the time when we first read it. I mean, thank goodness we read it again, because I was going to do it in turn 1 and drop it on his deployment zone, but actually when we reread the rules and we realised that the strike comes down in the following command phase, I decided to hold back at that point, because I thought, no, if I'm dropping it in his deployment zone, he's wanting to move everything forward anyway. I'm going to hit nothing, and it's going to be wasted of 3 CP. So instead we looked at sort of when, or I looked at when might be the best time for me to do it, and where. And I think the decision to drop it effectively on one of the objectives, to sort of put that choice into Winter's head about where he was moving, it was about board control. It's 3CP, it's still very expensive. The odds are you're not going to do a huge amount of damage, because it comes in the following turn, so your opponent can react. You're not going to be killing sort of 30-40 models with it, but like I said, it's about board control. There was a big unit of 30 boys on that objective. By putting it over them, it forced them to potentially move. I mean, if I'd done 6 mortal wounds with the orbital bombardment, that drops them down to 24. Then pile some shooting into them. You know, you clear some more of the squad, they're automa failing, their morale check, then they're on 1s and 2s running away. It was forcing him to make a decision and to potentially move away from where he wanted to be, or forcing him to make the decision as to whether or not he wanted to take those mortal wounds. He could have quite happily stayed there, but you know, it's effectively free dead guys for me if he does. And by forcing him to make that decision, he chose to move away a bit, still hold the objective, but be outside that real core sort of 3-inch range where you start taking real damage. I mean, as it happens, I did that damage to the to both units anyway, but that was real fluke. I think I rolled 3 6s in a row at that point to do that damage, so it was more effective than it could have been, less effective than it might have been had he not moved. Equally, the 3CP, like I said, it is a significant investment. It's a choice that you make for board control and to push your opponent away from where they necessarily want to be. And we did catch just in time before I tried to do it again that it's a once per game stratagem. Interestingly, I did check with the orbital array on the impulsor. Ironically, I didn't check the shield dome, but I did check the orbital array on the impulsor. The orbital array does not use the same rules as the stratagem. It's far more similar, if not the same, as the old orbital bombardment. It's a random range, which I'm a little bit surprised about, because it's essentially the same thing. However, I think the number of points you would have needed to add to the orbital array to allow an impulsor to call in a strike like that would have meant that you just wouldn't take it. It would be far too much. It's good as a stratagem because you've got the CP from the start and you're getting them refreshed every turn. It wouldn't have been good if you'd had to pay points for that ability and then lose out in the other 4 turns of the game from something actively doing damage regularly. So, I mean, would I use that stratagem again? Not very often. I used it because we wanted to show it off, and because it's different, and because it shows sort of an interesting tactical option for the new Marines. But it did shuffle his troops around a bit, and it did sort of probably help me in the long term in terms of what could get in, what was attacking where. But like I said, the key part of that phase of the game was bottlenecking those units. So the impulsor charged the Bonebreaker and held that up. That meant that, worst case scenario, his knobs were charging my impulsor. Now if I'd lost the impulsor, so be it. The whole point was to slow him down and to break up what units were charging, not to score the points for Oath of the moment by sitting there in the middle of the table, having a unit within 6 inches of the centre. I'm getting old. Completely lost my train of thought. Yeah. So we sort of took a charge with the outriders from the boys. Again, did I get lucky? It was another little bit of a bottleneck. I knew I was limiting the number of models that could fight by blocking the by sort of chucking those outriders into that part of the encampment. He was then sort of limited in the number of models that could actually get close, and the number of attacks that I'd be taking. Equally, it was just a unit of boys, and they were sort of striking at a toughness 5 bikes, so they wouldn't be wounding that easily. So I'd be sort of cutting down the potential damage that he could do. They did hold, thankfully, and they allowed the lieutenant and the 3 eliminators to then countercharge. And I think, as Winter said in the video, we talked about it. He asked me why I was charging last Fusel sniper, sort of tank snipers into a combat, but Primaris units are all okay in combat. Even a unit of 3 guys like that on the charge, it's 10 attacks, and against other armies would I have done it? Possibly not, but orcs don't have that armor save to fall back on, and so you're all decent for your hits and wounds, and every wound counts against orcs. Against, say, for example, Heretic Astartes, when they're saving those on 3-ups, it's not worth doing. But against orcs, you can probably kill 4, 5. It's not unreasonable to expect that sort of a return. So yeah, we held up the big boys unit with the bikes, and then countercharged with the other stuff to sort of to force some casualties on them. I must admit, I'd completely forgotten about Unstoppable Green Tide. I don't think I would or could have done anything different had I remembered it, but I hadn't counted on it at the time. And similarly, like I said, charged the Impulsor into the Bone Breaker. He then was forced to get the knobs out of the Bone Breaker and charge the Impulsor to try and clear it out of the way. Otherwise, I would have just sat it there the whole game. Potentially, I could have got the Blade Guard out the back and climbed over the encampment wall and still got in that way around. Equally, his own infantry could have got up and gone around the outside, but it was an awkward charge if he tried to do that. I don't think it would have been that sensible, because my Inceptors were stood the other side of that wall. Don't think he would have made or the odds wouldn't have been in his favour of getting that charge off. And certainly the odds would have been in favour of the Inceptors for doing a lot of damage to the knobs in the following turn. So we held the knobs up. As it happened, the Impulsor survived just. That was when I had to make the choice to fall back, which cost me a victory point for Oath of Moment, so one of the Oaths of Moment that turn, because having fallen back you can't score it. But again, it was the sensible thing to do, I think. The Impulsor would have died the next turn anyway, and then the knobs would have charged my boys rather than the other way round. At that point, I think that was when I brought the Intercessors in on my table edge into the centre of my table edge to hold the objective in my deployment zone. Again, conscious decision to say I want to hold this objective. I'm bringing the troops onto it so that I'm then forcing a tactical choice. The reason behind that is I'm sort of contesting the 2 central objectives. If Winters wanted to hold more than me, he was going to have to push me off something, and that pretty much guaranteed I was always holding at least 1, so he had to hold 2. I think narratively speaking it works as well. as we said at the start, sort of the picture in my head of my force was sort of these two flanking forces, and then the main body of the Space Marines, if you like, moving up through the centre, that would then enter the battle later. I think that worked sort of reasonably well, and that was, like I said, the picture that I had in my mind when I was doing it. So falling back with the impulsor, I could then target the knobs who were now out in the open. I didn't want to rely on the blade guard clearing them, so I did pour quite a bit of shooting into them. I mean, as it happened, when we rolled the dice, the blade guard would have wiped them in the turn anyway, but again, that was a good set of dice rolls, and not one that I wanted to rely on getting, because that's normally when your dice turn around and stab you in the back. So I thought by clearing them out with some of the shooting, or some of them out with shooting first, gave me a better chance of getting rid of the whole unit in the turn. I must say, at that point, when Captain Dark charged into Big Bob, I was expecting rather more fireworks than I got. Yeah, I like the core unit mechanic, and I also quite like that they're not restricting it particularly to a limited few units. It does hurt the characters quite a lot. I mean, it's certainly beneficial. I mean, don't get me wrong. Hitting on 2s and re-rolling 1s, it's not good from a game and an enjoyment perspective. You get lots of re-rolls. Effectively, your characters pretty much never miss. And the same with the wounds, with the lieutenant around, re-rolling 1s to wound. All of a sudden, the odds of you actually getting through with all of your attacks, your characters just mince their way through all sorts of stuff. And they became very reliable during 8th. We all got used to it. We all had that sort of that character that we liked, who used to do lots of damage, hit with lots of attacks, wound with most of them. And I think, as I said in the debrief, the chat that we had after the game, last time I used him, he minced his way through a Night Lord's Warlord in a single turn. It was slightly disappointing, having got used to the sort of damage that characters can do. It was then a bit disappointing for him to bounce so much against Big Mac Bob, who is not really a massive combat warlord himself. I could have taken some alternative relics potentially to have increased his damage, but actually I think the Vox Spiritum, which buffs his Rights of War ability out to 9 inches, that really helped me a lot throughout the game, and I think I got more out of that than I would have done out of more damage from the character. And it was epic. I mean, let's face it, it was about sort of 4 or 5 turns of combat. They were slugging away at each other. I mean, narratively speaking, from the position that it was, clearly Bob was just sort of jumping up in the air and trying to avoid Dark's sword from chopping him off at the knees, but it was certainly a combat for the ages, in respect of the number of saves and rolls that each of the characters was making. Love the Blade Guard. I've seen a lot of salt, shall we say, from non-Space Marine players about Blade Guard on the internet, and they are a precision tool in my experience. Throw them at the wrong thing and they will bounce. The storm shields are nice. The 2-up save is brilliant until you face a melee unit. Anything with any kind of melee weapon that's got -2 AP and multiple damage is going to clean up a squad of 3 in short order. Again, as I said, I'd used them against Heretic Astartes in the game before, and they'd ended up in combat with some obliterators. I thought, I know, a clever plan, you know, brains working here, let's consolidate into the obliterators. That'll stop them shooting, and they're not that great in combat, are they? They're good enough. Good enough to clear out 3 Blade Guard at least. So yeah, they're very good at what they do. Throw them at the wrong thing and they will fail. And that was foremost in my head in terms of me getting the charge against the knobs rather than being charged by them, because I had no confidence whatsoever that 10 knobs would not kill 3 Blade Guard. They did really well. I'll be honest, I wasn't expecting them to absorb the charge of the Bonebreaker. I wrote a, I think, quite fun piece of narrative after the game from my Blade Guard Sergeant's perspective, Sergeant Stone, where I put a narrative spin on that part of the game that I think has gone up on my my chapters blog, swordsofdawn.blogspot.com. It's where all the narrative behind the chapter is. It's still very much a work in progress. I've got a lot of things that I want to do and a finite amount of time to do them in, and the Marines take a long time to paint. So I am sort of adding to the blog as and when, but we've certainly got some narrative bits and bobs on there, and I think I posted up at the weekend the narrative story covering that one. The intention is that blog will also hold all the narrative for all of the campaigns that I go through with the Swords of Dawn. I'm currently running a crusade against some Night Lords. That will hopefully form the next couple of game reports on the channel. We've got a couple of little 25 power games in a couple of weeks' time, following on from the first crusade game I played. I'll do a like a narrative introduction to those games over the next few days and get that up on the channel before they come up, and I'll go through my lists as well, so that we can get the actual game reports up and you can get a feel for why I've written the list how I did beforehand. Then go through the game report to see how the game actually pans out, and then I'll probably do a debrief like this afterwards as well, and just sort of explain the choices that I made through the game, why I made them, hopefully why they were narrative, and then look at where the crusade paperwork takes the army going forward. We have picked up one bonus already after the first game. That was Captain Dark has picked that one up, mainly because of him sort of piling into the Chaos Lord and mincing his way through that, and then sending a unit of Night Lord's Space Marines herring off in sheer terror. Yeah, let's call it that. Yeah, tangent again, back to the game. So yeah, the Blade Guard did really well. Sort of held up the Bonebreaker, and then smashed it the following turn, and piled through into the Shock Jump Dragsters. I think the Outrider then went in to support them, and finally we got the Ancient and Big Mac Bob. The Ancient and Captain Dark finally put paid to Big Mac Bob. I think it was actually the Ancient that dealt the final blow. I think he sort of must have hit him with his banner or something, because can't for the life of me understand why a Blade Guard Ancient doesn't carry a sword, or even a knife. No, he's got a pistol, but that's it. But he did the job with the banner anyway. The plasma inceptors over on the left cleared house, which, to be honest, I'm used to them doing. I know a lot of people rate the assault bolter inceptors, and Winters himself has got 3 big units of, I think he's got 18 of them altogether. They do put out a lot of fire, but I've always liked the plasmas. Back when Shadow Spear first was released, the Vanguard Warlord trait was +1 to hit for any kind of unit, and for a couple of weeks it was glorious when my Phobos captain was giving +1 to hit to my plasma inceptors. Then they were hitting on 2s, can't possibly overcharge and overheat and kill themselves. And I played a game against Grey Knights, I think it was, Grandmaster with his 3-up invuln save of cheese, and one squad of 5 or 6 inceptors saw the way through all of his wounds in a single shooting phase, which made me happy. I don't think it won me the game, but it made me happy. They did really well. I mean, they came in, they finished off the truck, they took most of the Bonebreaker's wounds, they cleared out some boys, the Gretchen out on the left flank. Didn't get around to getting the truck, but potentially if we had 6, 7 turn games, then that was certainly going to be their next target. I was really pleasantly surprised with the intercessors, actually. The Stalker intercessors that came marching onto the field. They sort of put some useful fire across the table. Interesting stratagem as well, that the rapid fire stratagem now lets intercessor units fire twice, or fire a second time, should I say, during the phase. It used to, the intercessors used to have individual stratagems. So you had the target sighted stratagem for the Stalkers, which was my original plan, was to use that one with them, sort of have 10 of those guys and have them pick off characters. But the new stratagem is really nice because it was something that I felt was missing in the Space Marine arsenal. You've got a lot of the factions out there have got stratagems to fire a second time, and Space Marines didn't. Don't get me wrong, they had plenty of strong tools and strong options, so it wasn't like it was a problem for them in terms of winning games, but it did feel like it was sort of a missed opportunity, or something that perhaps ought to have been there at the expense of something else. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying they should have had extra bonus sort of stratagems, but yeah, it did feel like that was sort of a sensible option for them to have that they didn't have access to. But in the end, it didn't actually make a difference in the game. But I was very surprised at just how well those intercessors held up when they got charged by the large unit of boys that had recycled. That was essentially why I dropped the impulsor back. Whereas I was thinking I'd need the extra Stormbolter shots. Totally forgot at the time that it had fallen out of combat, and fly keyword doesn't let you shoot when you do that anymore. And as it happens, it's not got the fly keyword anymore. But the original intention was that would then support the fire of the intercessors in trying to clear that squad. As it happened, they did some good shooting. Winters failed the charge, which really hurt. I think if he'd made that charge, the game potentially could have gone a different way, because I would have had to have dealt with them, which would probably have meant the Inceptors wouldn't have dealt with the boys that they did. He would have been getting a lot more primary objective points as a result. I think the big I mean, that was essentially the game. You know, that sort of the Blade Guard and the captain had battered their way through the middle. The Dreadnought came in from the flank and sort of first tied up and then started beating the Killer Cans back. The left flank, essentially, once I got rid of the looters, there wasn't much there that could threaten the Inceptors, and again I got the jump on them. By keeping them in reserve, the looters were on the table, I got to fire first, and I think whichever of those two units had fired first at the other one would have resulted in that flank belonging to that faction. You know, if the looters had shot the Inceptors, I can't see that I would have had them left. There's a really nice new stratagem for Gravis units, which is essentially their save is improved by 1 against single damage weapons. We'll see that a lot because I think heavy intercessors will be a big thing going forwards. I will be getting some, and yeah, sure, there'll be games when they form the core of my army, but that will be from a narrative perspective. I'm not going to go out there and just start piling Gravis armor and Gravis armor and Gravis armor, and ultimately if I do take a Gravis armored force, it's probably going to be everything Gravis armor, and so I'm going to suffer in other areas because it's going to be slower. I'm not going to have many models on the board. I'm not going to have as much range from stuff like aggressors, inceptors. They're still quite mobile, but I mean, we've still not seen any real assault troops in Gravis armor yet. Aggressors have got power fist, yes, but their main role is fire support, not combat. Would I like to see Gravis assault troops? Yes, because again I think it's a hole that not needs filling, but it's an obvious gap in the range, and I don't see any reason why there wouldn't be Gravis combat troops. I essentially see Gravis armor from a narrative perspective as being there for hostile environments, or you know, right in the thick of siege breaking, that type of role. And I think sort of Gravis guys with either really heavy thunderhammers, similar to the Deathwatch heavy thunderhammer, or potentially dual swords would be very cool. Heck, I mean, you know, it kind of almost lends itself to lightning claws, the armor. They would look very nice and would be very Raven Guard. So yeah, do that, Games Workshop. Dual lightning claw Gravis, please. Next month. Doesn't take that long to sculpt stuff, does it? Yeah, let's have some of that before Christmas, definitely. So yeah, that was the sort of, that was the game in a nutshell. I mean, it at the end of turn 5, it looked like a massacre, with only the truck left. It really didn't feel like that from my point of view. Turn 4, I was still nervous that, you know, the Orcs had enough assets on the board to win the game. Certainly with the secondaries that we picked and the way the primaries were going, there was a lot of scope for them to still be scoring had things gone their way. I think I made the right choices at the time. I think I stuck to my original sort of narrative theme of the Phobos, so the Vanguard units being pushed forwards and the Tacticus units coming in to support them. The narrative reason for the Dreadnought coming in from the flank was clearly had been dropped in by a flyer. I forget what the Primaris flyer in the Fluff Squad, I think it's the Overlord. But you know, I mean, the Storm Raven can transport an old style Dreadnought in claws on the back. There's clearly got to be a Primaris version of that for the Redemptors, and yeah, that's how that happened. Yeah, sort of the idea that the Vanguard found the enemy and held them in place while the Tacticus units came up to then push them back, and I think that worked pretty well on the board. I mean, if you sort of go back and watch the report again, yeah, that would be good. Like it, put some nice comments in. But yeah, so when you watch the ebb and sort of flow of the battle, I didn't push the Vanguard forward that much. The idea was for them to be present and hold, and then for the less stealthy elements to push up and sort of beyond. Sort of another film reference, A Bridge Too Far. The hold until relieved was sort of echoing around my head in terms of how I wanted to play the game. I mean, thankfully, the relief forces actually arrived in the game as opposed to in the film, which I say the film, the actual Operation Market Garden. Lest we forget, it was a real thing, and there were a lot of people, a lot of very brave people, gave their lives throughout that conflict. Let's hope that we never have to go through anything like that again. But from game perspective, I think my narrative plan worked, and I think it came through. Well, certainly it came through for me when I watched it back, but I suppose I did know what I was trying to do. Did it come through for you? Let me know in the comments. If not, I'll try and make it clearer in the next game what I'm trying to do from a story perspective. I think that's probably enough yammering on from me for today. It's just over an hour now, so I'm going to go and get a drink and possibly paint some buildings. Slightly ironic, I guess, that I've just played a game against orcs and now I'm painting orc buildings. Maybe I'll paint some of the Imperial stuff instead. That would probably make more sense, given that that's what's likely to be used in my next few games. But yeah, thank you very much for listening, and if you made it all the way through to the end, even more thank you. Drop a like, comments. Yeah, happy to receive any comments. If you've got any questions or any suggestions, please drop them in there as well. Hopefully I've sort of followed up on some of the comments that I've had on some of my previous videos about the sound levels. I'm still getting used to editing software and editing reports and doing all that stuff, and I am still using the basic iMovie app on my phone for now. It's certainly doing what I want it to do at the moment. Once I've figured out that there's a volume control on each of the individual tracks, but maybe I'll look at sort of alternatives as we go forward, for more professional editing software. At the moment, I don't want to spend well, literally that. I don't want to spend because I want to buy more grade plastic. No, I don't want to lash out for expensive editing software if this isn't going to sort of go somewhere in the longer term. So we'll see how that goes. But I'll keep doing the video logs. Hopefully that was interesting for you. I've got a few bits and bobs that I'm going to be working on this week that will be different, so it won't just be endless videos of me decanting paint into dropper bottles again. It'll be something a bit different, and like I said, I think I'll probably do a couple of those little sort of army reviews of what I'm going to be using in my next few games, and to talk through the themes and the narrative behind why I've put those together in the way that I have. Then hopefully we'll get another couple of game reports up, and if I'm lucky, and assuming my opponents don't mind me putting their gorgeous faces on the internet, then we might get some live action. Till next time, see you at Battle's Red Edge.